Hasdai Crescas writes in this chronicle of what happened during the massacres of Kuf Nun Aleph, and read it in the connection of the problem of evil. How does one respond to evil? What is the connection? How does this affect, or does it have any effect on emunah? What is the connection between these terrible tragedies and emunah? And I see that, I notice that Hasdai Crescas, there's no place that he, we'll see this, there's no place that he blames Hashem. He doesn't blame Hashem. But and he also doesn't try to explain or to justify, to say that there's a reason for what happened. But he writes very similar. He takes as his model Megillat Eicha. He writes like Eicha. He uses a lot of expressions from Eicha, and he writes like Yirmiyahu in Eicha. Now, what is this chronicle that we have here? The chronicle is written to the Kehillah of Avignon. Tofes HaKatav Asher Shalach HaEshel HaAdir Harav Misaragosa Shmo Don Ḥasdai Crescas El Kehilot Avignon. So why would he be writing to Kehilot Avignon? And an explanation was already given a long time ago by the great historian Yitzchak Ber, which seems to me to be correct. Makes sense that the king of Aragon, and we know that Hasdai Crescas was very close to the king and queen of Aragon, and the king of Aragon was related to the anti-pope. At this time, there were two popes in the Catholic Church. There was one in Rome and there was one in Avignon. It's a split in the church. And the king of Aragon, the king and queen of Aragon, were related to the pope in Avignon, and they were also big financial supporters of the pope in Avignon. So they had a certain amount of influence on him, and the idea was, and we know that he sent letters to the Pope, the king and queen of Aragon sent letters to the Pope, asking the Pope, pleading with the Pope to tell the priests not to preach against the Jews, not to kill the Jews. And so it makes sense that the Jews of Avignon had something to do with trying to explain to the Pope what the situation was, and it was important that they had accurate information about what happened, and that seems to be the reason that Hasdai Crescas is writing this historical chronicle about what happened. And he's writing it right after the time. We see that he's writing it in Mar Cheshvan, the beginning of Kuf Nun Bet, and right after the massacres are over. So let's.
How far is Saragossa to Avignon?
Not so far.
It's France?
Well, no.
Avignon
Spain,
is South
Spain.
France,
And
and Saragossa is North France.
Avignon
North.
wasn't in Spain?
No, Avignon is not. No, Avignon is South France.
Yeah.
Is there a way to get
We
through?
can find, someone has a telephone. We can find out in a second how many miles between.
But can you get through by land? There's no natural barriers?
Yes, by land, very easy. You get from Saragossa. What?
You can get on a bus 5 hours.
5 hours on a bus, okay.
Did Jews play a role?
The horse probably a little more. But.
Did Jews play a role in the two popes? Meaning, was there a difference in how to relate to Jews between the two popes? Was one of them worse than the other?
I don't know, but I don't know about that. Whether one was worse than the other. But there's one in the little treatise that he wrote against Christianity called Bitul Ikrei Notzrim. There's one place where he writes he writes something. He writes when the Mashiach comes, Nevuah is going to be restored. That's our principle. So he says, well, you claim that the Mashiach has already come, but there's no Nevuah today, so that's proof that the Mashiach hasn't come. And then he says, but now you can say that maybe you don't need Nevuah. But he says, but of course you need Nevuah. How else are you going to know which is the real Pope?
Wow.
So...
No, but the peace amongst the two was very terrible for Jews because Germany got wiped off the map. All the Jews in Germany.
You mean
Once they got consolidated, the Pope, the back to Rome, that's when the Jews suffered.
it was better that they were split because they were weaker.
At least in Germany, the Jews were around for another 50 years.
Right. So you're saying when the church was weaker, it was better for the Jews.
Yeah, they weren't.
But I know, for example, that the Rambam actually worked for the Pope in Avignon. He was the astronomer. He was paid by the Pope to do astronomical research.
Astrology.
Not astrology, astronomy.
Astronomy.
The Rambam also did some astrology on the side, but he was a real 100% astronomer. He was a very serious astronomer. And there's a crater on the moon
Named after him.
named after Rambam, and there's another one named after Rav Ibn Ezra. There's one named the two. Okay, so
The Rambam worked alongside which astronomer?
he was an astronomer.
But who did he work alongside?
He worked with a musicologist whose name he worked with a famous Christian.
So what I read is that they just he was just there to have like an honorary way.
The Rambam?
That's what I read. That the other guy was doing the work.
No. The Rambam is considered by historians of science to be very, 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 very serious.
How to measure this?
Right.
What's it called?
He had a Makel Yaakov. He had a
Jacob's staff.
Jacob's staff, Makel Yaakov, Jacob's staff, which was used for navigating until the modern period.
And its principles are still being used today.
And it's still being used today.
Yeah.
So he was a very, very serious mathematician and astronomer. He worked together with a Christian scholar on musicology. There was a famous Christian musician who was a Rambam. But in terms of his astronomical work, the Rambam was the authority of the time, and that's why
If you could give sort of the history, the background about the Jews in Durin Tzarfas, Avenue, Provence, because this is really what we're talking about now. Avenue is one of the. It's also called Provence. No, it's not called Provence.
Right, it's Provence.
And they had big shaykhs with the Jews in Spain. This
right.
is the shaykhs what Ḥasdai has with him.
Right, absolutely.
He's in Spain.
Absolutely, but
so can you explain us a little bit about the uniqueness of the Jews during Tzarfas, that they had connection with both worlds.
Right. Well, South France is very close to Spain, and South France is Provence, and it was a center of Jewish philosophy, mostly in the period a little bit before Hasdai Crescas, but all these. The Rambam and Narboni and Caspi, all these Tibon, they were all in South France in Provence. Meiri, right, Meiri in the later period, right. Okay, let's look at what he says and I want to try to understand his how he is personally reacting. He records here also the murder of his only son. Later on, he had another after the tragedy. He remarried, had another son and 3 daughters, but at this point he only has one son, and the son is murdered during riots in Barcelona. In Barcelona, remember, Hasdai Crescas was brought up and educated in Barcelona, and then he moved to Zaragoza to take on a position in Zaragoza, of Rav in Zaragoza. But his city was the city of Barcelona, and that was completely destroyed. In the Jewish community of Barcelona was completely destroyed. So אם אמרתי אספרה לכם רובי התלאות אשר מצאונו ישתוממו רעיוניכם. I can't tell you everything that happened because you would go crazy. האומנם ארוך לפניכם שולחן הרעה מאותר ראש ולענה בקצרה והדברים כהווייתן. להשביעכם מרורות לענתנו ולהשקותכם מיין בצפוננו. ואם אחשוב כבר הוגד לכם. So here he says, he's not really writing this to give them information, because he knows you basically heard most of what's happened, but you have to get the precise details. So I think that seems to be what he says. You've already heard basically what happened to us here in Spain, but you don't have the precise information. You know in general what happened, but you don't have the precise information. Which we know the Rav Hasdai Crescas in any case prefers to write betachlit hakotzer al haseder. He says, I'm going to tell you in the order of everything happened, how it happened, the order of how it happened, to let you know what how it happened. And it begins Yom Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. It begins by Rosh Chodesh Tammuz Kuf Nun Aleph. Right, 4th of June, 1391, Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. Everything happens basically in Tammuz and Av. It's connected with Eicha. It's connected with the Churban Habayit. Yom Rosh Chodesh Tammuz Hamar v'hanimhar Darach Hashem kashto k'oyev Al kehilat Sevilla Rabati Am. Sevilla, Kamo Yerushalayim Ha'ir Rabati Am. Sevilla Rabati Am. He speaks about Sevilla, Toledo, and Barcelona as they were Yerushalayim, Churban. This is a Churban, and he uses the language of Eicha Darach Hashem Kashto Ko'oyev Al Kehilat Sevilla Rabati Am Hayuba Kamo Shisha O Shiva Alafim Baalei Batim. So there, let's say 6,000, 7,000 Baalei Batim. Does that mean maybe how much is it? Maybe 4 or 5 people to
30,000 people.
Right, about 30,000 people in Sevilla. Heitzitu be'esha areha hargu ba'am rav ach rubam hemiro. So he's giving you the situation. Right? They killed many people. They killed many Jews, but most of the Jews converted. Umehem machru liyishmaelim hataf v'hanashim.
When we say converted, we mean to Christianity, right?
To Christianity, of course. These are Christians. These are all Christians. Except here, the only mention of the Yishmaelim is right here. And I tried to look it up this morning, or last night. I tried to look up this the slave trade, there were these Barbary pirates in the Barbary coast in Morocco and Tunisia and Algiers, who would come into the Mediterranean cities and capture mostly Christians and sell them as slaves. This is a little bit. This, according to the things I was reading, starts mostly in the 16th century, but it goes all the way back to Roman times. They were doing this all along. So he doesn't say who these Yishmaelim are, and I was surprised to see that I didn't see in various articles about this who the
Were there any
Yishmaelim.
Ishmaelim living in Spain at the time?
Sure.
In the lower part?
Well, you had the Yishmaelim. It could be that they sold them to the Yishmaelim who were still in the south in
South of Spain.
the south of Spain of Andalusia.
They persecuted Jews more than Muslims, the Christians.
The Ran has something very interesting about
It
this.
looks like they sold the Jews too.
Right. But there's a place where the Ran talks, and he says, the Ran says that when he mentions that when the Christians persecute the Jews, the Jews are able to. He says it's good. Ran says it's good that there's not one government in the world.
Because you have to go.
Because when the Christians persecute the Jews, you go to Islamic. When the Muslims persecute the Jews, you go to Christians. He gives him Avram Avinu. He said, if Nimrod ran the whole world, Avraham Avinu would have no place. Okay. Okay, so it begins in Seville, and it begins. Why does it begin in Seville? It begins in Seville. It begins in the city of Seville because there were these very fierce anti-Jewish priests who were calling for the death of all the Jews. Either the Jews had to convert to Christianity or be killed. And the kings generally in Spain, in fact, most of the kings all over the world protected Jews. Because the kings knew that it's good to have Jews. The Jews were they were loyal. They were intelligent. They were profitable. The Jews made money. The Jews were loyal to the king. They were intelligent. They advanced the sciences and everything. So the kings usually tried to protect the Jews. But what happened in Seville in 1390, the king fell off his horse and was killed in a horse accident. And his son was 10 years old. And the son was not really able to rule, so there was really no king.
There's no queen?
I don't know. Apparently she wasn't able to rule.
Who was the regent?
If it were, it depends who the queen is. Apparently, this queen did not. You have to have a certain amount of power to rule. In any case, Kuf Nun Aleph in Gematria is Ein Melech. So they also referred to this year as Shnat Ein Melech. They didn't mean Ein Melech HaKadosh Baruch Hu, although maybe some of them meant that too. That Ein Melech. But Ein Melech in the sense that in Castile they had no king. They had this 10-year-old young man who was unable to control the church. Okay. Okay. Hargub ba'am rav. Achrubam hemiru, umehem machru Yishmaelim, and many were sold as slaves to the Yishmaelim. Hataf v'hanashim, the young people and the women were sold as slaves to the Muslims. V'hayom, Mesilat HaYehudim, the Jewish street, Mesilat HaYehudim, which is called in Catalan the Kal of the Jews, Yoshevet Badad. Umehem metu al Kiddushat Hashem, V'rabim chilulu brit kodesh. So some died on Kiddush Hashem, and many chilulu at Hashem. And so this is very, very typical of the writing of Hasdai. Crescas, he just states things simply. Kiddu et Hashem, chilulu et Hashem. Misham yatsa ha'esh v'tochal.
Means they were raped or something? Chilulu Brit Kodesh means they were raped or something?
No, they converted.
No, I think that means they converted. Chilulu Brit Kodesh, they converted. They didn't.
So it's repetitious. He writes a Rambam Hamidu, and then he repeats it again.
So it may be referring, I was thinking if it refers to something else, Chilul Brit Kodesh, but I don't know what it could refer to otherwise.
Shabbos?
Metu HaKiddush Hashem is also a repetition because he starts saying that they killed. So there's no way, there are no two ways to.
No, some people were just plain killed. And
Some were just plain
people
killed and
were
some
given the
killed.
offer and
Right.
Why would some?
just killed.
Right, they were killed without choice. They were
It's
just...
just Hashem.
Just killed and you're given an offer.
משם יצא אש ותאכל את ארזי הלבנון,
Arish.
העיר הקדושה, קהילת קורדובה, that's the home of the Rambam, גם שם המירו רבים, תהי לחורבה, maybe this is a play on words, Cordova, Chorva, right, Cordova was turned into a Chorva, and there he doesn't speak about Yeshua Hashem, he says many converted. Uveyom tzara v'tochacha, yom shehuchpelu bo tzarot, that's what Chazal say about Shiva Sar B'Tammuz. Shiva Sar B'Tammuz, Hamat Hashem nitacha, al ir hakodesh, asher misham teitzei Torah v'devar Hashem, he kehilat Tolitula, Toledo. So here he's speaking about Toledo, mash as if it were Tzion, Yerushalayim, Hamat Hashem nitacha, al ir hakodesh, asher misham teitzei Torah v'devar
It
Hashem.
was the most important place.
Right,
It was
Toledo.
Out of the three.
Right. Certainly, much more important than than Seville and also Cordova. V'yehargu b'mikdash Hashem Kohen v'Navi, shama kidshu et Hashem b'rabim rabbaneha, hem hazera hakasher hanivchar, zera harav Rav Asher ben Yechiel Harosh. These are the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of the Rosh. Zichron tzadikim u'kedoshim levracha. Hem uveneihem v'talmideihem. Gam sham hemiru rabim. Lo yochlu lamod al nafsham. So all these places
You
again.
see, the Rosh had still a huge influence in Toledo.
Right.
Years after his passing.
Right.
I mean, he's
Yes, you know,
referencing,
he was an important person afterwards.
but it's referencing his Talmud, his
This-
Medrash, his true family.
Ze hadden gewoon zien, eindelijk zijn de gemeen Raboenen dat.
But they also there's other evidence, not from here, but other evidence that the grandchildren and of the great grandchildren of the Rosh actually killed themselves and killed their family. So as not
in
to
good Ashkenazi tradition.
in the Ashkenazi tradition, which was not which was the Ashkenazi tradition, but not the Sephardi tradition. But it's not mentioned here. But that's
He says that he killed his wife. but
exactly in this
But
poem.
he lived in a right?
Exactly,
He killed his wife.
exactly, right.
He killed his wife, his mother-in-law, and his kids.
Yeah.
He killed who?
He killed his shveya, his wife.
He didn't trust that she will be.
He himself also got killed. The
Yes,
himself
yes,
also got killed.
Yes.
He killed himself.
I think so. I don't. It's very hard to say what these reports. Reports.
No, I'm saying,
mean, yeah.
but the report, the writes in the bottom.
Oh, did I
Hikriv Ishtala Oida Bunov means to say that he did it, or
That's what people think.
who says? I don't see it from this words.
Which note is it? Number
16.
16.
16. Kavanah ben Asher, Yehuda ben Asher,
I don't see it.
Nino shel Harosh, ve'ishto v'yiladav v'talmidav. Okay, so this is based on this kina of Rav Yaakov ibn Alvana al Praot. V'Rabbi Yehuda hikriv ishto le'ola uvanav b'kerev Yisrael. It's not clear. He could mean it metaphorically. We have the same thing with Hasdai Crescas.
Maybe it means metaphorical.
Could mean metaphorically, but it's
He
we
lost
see
his family.
we see the same thing. We'll see the same thing of Hasdai Crescas in a minute when he says Ha'leitiv la'olah.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean he did it himself.
He doesn't. And one historian actually wrote that Hasdai Crescas was in Barcelona and actually killed his son.
Based upon that.
Right, but we know that that's absolutely impossible because we have documents
It's roughly as Hatzman for sure.
that what?
This that they killed themselves definitely later on. He writes it himself. That they killed themselves.
Yeah.
That they killed themselves rather than fall.
Right.
They threw themselves over.
Right. They threw themselves in Barcelona. They threw themselves off they jumped off the tower. Right.
Is the letter still the same kingdom as Seville?
What?
Is the letter the same kingdom as
Yes,
Seville?
Castile. Right.
It's all Castile.
It's all the first three cities are Castile, namely Seville, Córdoba, and Toledo. That's Castile, which is in the south, and then they started moving north. Al shalosh elu rogza aretz milvad kehilot acherot. So he's going to say, ba misparam kamo shivim ir. Right, that there were 70 villages which were attacked and destroyed. Uvachol zot anachnu po beketer Aragon al hamashber v'haya lanu halayla v'hayom lemishmar. They're hearing about what's happening in Aragon. Vayehi v'shiva lechodesh av. Now we're coming right for Tisha B'Av. Bila Hashem v'lo chamal. He uses, he's using all the time the Lashon of Eicha. Bila Hashem v'lo chamal. Bekehilat Valencia. Hayuba kamo 1,000 baalei batim. V'hayu hametim b'kedusha 250 anashim. Hanisharim heranasu. They tried to escape to the mountains. V'nimlatu ma'atim, but only a few were able to escape. V'rubam heniru. Now, what happened in Valencia when Ḥasdai Crescas and the Rivash were both students of the Ran in Barcelona, and then the Rivash was appointed Rav in Saragossa, and he remained there until there was a certain dispute in Saragossa, and he moved from Saragossa to Valencia. So the Rav the chief Rav in Valencia was the Rivash, and Rav Ḥasdai Crescas replaced the Rivash in Saragossa. He came to Saragossa. Rav Ḥasdai Crescas was the Rav in Saragossa. The king and queen were in Saragossa, and the king's brother, who later became king, Marti, was in Valencia at the time. And what happened in Valencia was only recently discovered by an archivist, a famous archivist in Barcelona named Jaume Riera, who died a few years ago. He was in the archives of the Crown of Catalan, and he discovered documents about the Rivash, documents that the Rivash was called in by the brother of the king, Marti, and by the heads of Valencia. He was called in and he was told, all the Jews have either been killed or have converted to Christianity. All the synagogues have been turned into churches. Now let's put an end to all this. You have to convert. And the Rivash said, I'm not converting. And then they said to him, they brought some witnesses. And the witnesses came, and the documents survived. The witnesses said that the Rivash had sexual relations with Christian virgins, young Christian girls. And they said, we're going to burn you at the stake, not as a Jew, but as a Jew who had relations with Christian girls, sexual relations with Christian girls. On Tisha B'Av, Kuf Nun Aleph, the Rivash converts to Christianity. And several months later, or maybe a year later, he's on a boat, which I presume that Hasdai Crescas arranged for him because there was an article by Yom Tov Assis, who was a historian at the Hebrew University, Allah Shalom, Yom Tov Asis, that Hasdai Crescas arranged both ship passage for Jews to leave Christian Spain and to go either to Eretz Israel or to North Africa. And the Rivash gets on a boat and is somehow allowed to leave, because he was functioning for several months, maybe a year, as a Christian in Valencia under the name of Jaume de Valencia. But he's able to get on a ship, goes to Algeria, and in Algeria becomes the head of the Beit Din and a very important Rav. And Ad Hayom Hazeh, the Jews of Algeria paskin according to the Rivash. Rivash is their main. And
Is that any reference?
my wife's mother, who comes from Algeria, had books from the halacha was the halacha of the Rivash. All the minhagim are minhagim of the Rivash. The Rivash lived another, I think he lived, after he got to Algeria, he lived another 30 years. And most of his Piskei Halacha, I think, were written in Algeria, not in Spain.
Are there any other references in rabbinic literature to his conversion, or is it
No,
only source?
no reference at all. This is just completely new discovery. The only thing that is that may be connected, we know that the Rashbat was in Mallorca and escaped from
Tashbitz.
the Tashbitz, right? Tashbitz, right? Shimon ben Semach Duran, right? The Tashbitz was on the Beit Din, of the Rivash, and after the Rivash dies, he writes that he has tremendous charata that he didn't treat the Rivash with the sufficient kavod that he should have treated him, and because he had he doesn't say what he had against him, but he may have had against him this the conversion. But that's just a possibility, we don't know. But we do know that he had a charata after that he should have treated the great Rav.
He also
That
got
he
a
should
job
have
in the
treated him
government
with
when he
coke.
converted. What was his job? He also got a
That
job
was
that year. He had a-
The one who got the job was the Ephodi.
The Fuzzy got the job?
Yeah. The Ephodi is another story where Hasdai Crescas, I think we should see Hasdai Crescas helping his associates. So in any case, the Rivash, therefore, the question always comes up: what do you do in a situation like this? And many times the Chachmei Yisrael were in a situation that they had to decide what to do. By the way, the Rivash, another hint of the Rivash's his history is his Piskei Halacha. I think of all the poskim in the Christian world, he's the most lenient with regard to the conversos. He has some Piskei Halacha which are very lenient. Welcoming them back, right. Exactly, right.
He created the system.
Right. So what happened with the Ephodi? What happened with the Ephodi? Ephodi was.
How would they explain? How would the Rivash explain that it's one of the Shalosh Aveira that you need to do?
He could have been
Because if it would be killed because of
There was a system of conversion.
I didn't ask you. What is it?
I don't. He discusses it in his. Yeah, I think I probably mentioned it in my book someplace. I'd probably give a reference to his to the truth. There are two tshuvas of the Rivash where he mentions it. That I think he presumes. I think maybe it's because he presumes that they weren't true conversions. First, maybe that they're not avodah zarah. The Rambam, with regard to Islam, definitely says explicitly that it's not avodah zarah. Talking about Islam, he says explicitly that someone who converts to Islam is just telling a lie, that you think that Muhammad is the prophet, but you haven't. Now, the Rivash does it. He explains himself in these two Piskei Halacha, but can't remember exactly what his argument was, but it's probable that he doesn't consider it avodah zarah. But it's also probable that he doesn't consider it a real conversion. That you say something.
Right, that's what I
Yeah.
heard that
Yeah.
there was a system of conversion. He sprinkled water on you. He didn't have to say you accept the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
But the time is they have the
They
Jesus.
just,
Every time
No.
when someone converts,
No.
it's coerced.
No, but
It
you
is
didn't have
actually
to say.
a conversion.
You didn't have to be Makabel a minister Shilish.
En dat is moesten nepen zijn.
No, but
Push leader wasn't it?
the clue. No, I think his main argument has to do with the concept of onus. Concept of onus that you're not
Tell me
that
one
you're not
time. Tell me
responsible.
one time there's not an onus. Always b'shalosh shavuos chametz you're onus.
Okay.
If not, what do you mean?
It
If
depends
not
what
onus,
kind of
I'm
oinus.
sure you shouldn't do it.
Depends
So-
on the level of
It's
oinus.
like it's interesting.
Okay,
He said that in Cordova,
so
fact that nobody
For
went
next
to
time,
see the
take a look
slave
at the
Right,
shuvas of the take a look at the shuvas of the Rivash, and then we can,
There's a heter if it's Yisirim Sha'aylam Sof. Like if they force you
Yeah, perhaps.
with
Even more.
unstoppable pain,
Torture.
then torture for
Then
then there is a heter to
Okay.
be over on the Shorish Shavuos.
right. So here, clearly, this was we see with the Rivash himself, according to the way it was reconstructed from these documents by Jean Riera, that at first he said, "Okay, kill me. I'm not going to convert." But when they said that we're going to burn you at the stake as someone who had sexual relations with him, then he said, "This is a tremendously big chilul Hashem."
That's what he's saying. There's no Kiddush Hashem because if he's being killed for something
For something
as vile
else,
as
right?
this, then there's no
He's
B'nai
being-
Dashti,
right,
there's no
right.
successor.
Exactly.
Like not everybody will know the truth.
Rather
Everybody will know the full.
be a-
They'll know the false thing.
Yeah,
They'll
but
know the
rather be a
false-
pervert than a convert. Rather be a pervert than not be a
Convert.
Yeah.
No,
I would think.
there's no B'nai Dashti.
Rather,
Unless it
rather
was
be a pedophile.
No,
than
he
a
doesn't
pervert.
forget.
No, but
Hey, look at the Rivash took a guy to target.
rather be.
Yeah.
With
Oil mijn zijn.
What happened-
Mention my mind to delegation.
What happened with
Unless
what happened with the Ephodi? I think I mentioned the
in
Ephodi.
the cities.
I think I mentioned the story of the Ephodi in one of our earlier sessions.
Yeah,
What happened with the Ephodi was different. Ephodi was in Perpignan, and in Perpignan, actually, most of the Jews were not murdered, and didn't. But Ephodi was forced to convert, and there are some interesting things there. That after he converts, he writes. I think I mentioned this already a few sessions ago. He writes the two most fierce anti-Christian books that we have in Hebrew literature, Al Tehika Avotecha and Klimata Goyim. Very, very strong and brilliant anti-Christian books that are really very strong, tough arguments against Christianity. That nobody else wrote two books like this. And meanwhile, he has just converted to Christianity. They let him write these books. No one touches him. He writes these books in Hebrew. We also know that at this time he's selling Hebrew manuscripts in Spain, in southern France, and in Italy, going around. Yes,
I wanted to know all these references to books that are written as answers to Christian from
Yeah.
Crescas and from
Yeah, yeah.
Foodie and all the others. Are they all addressing one Christianity, or it's like one is addressed to Lahavdul and Elif al-Fabdulis, let's say to Hasidim, one's to Lubavitch. We have different versions
the
of Judaism. Is the corpus of the Christianity like continuously the same and everybody attacks it, or this guy addresses a different
I think it's
Judaism?
more or less the same, but there are little details that the scholars can
Let's
point
say
out.
Kabbalah versus philosophy. If somebody would attack Judaism, they would have to have a different approach to two books.
Right, right.
So is Christianity the same message always? It's like
No, there are
whatever it
different.
is?
There are different versions of Christianity, but as far as the medieval Jews were concerned, they were just concerned about attacking the New Testament. They weren't concerned about.
The New Testament doesn't have anything bad against the Jews per se. Only
No,
interpretation.
but they're just to show that they were
It's not
concerned to argue against
It's divinity.
argue against the
parable
divinity
with
of
Samaritan-
Jesus
Samaritan.
and the Trinity, and that's what they were concerned.
The basic, the Dratz Animam. Everybody has the same.
So, but
A lot of it is also concerned with the references in the Old Testament that they used to hint to Jesus.
Right, of course. Right, they did that too. Right, that was also okay. What happened? So what happened with Ephodi? He
That's the most thing.
what happened?
Shia, all this kind of
So Ephodi, he's officially a Christian, and he's listed in all the books as after 1391. He's listed as a Christian. He has a Christian name, Honore, something or other. He has a Christian name, and and there's several other things that's unusual about him. I mentioned that most of the Maimonideans, most of the Chachamim who are Talmidei Rambam, did not agree with the Rambam about the Rambam's view of astrology. The Rambam thought astrology was avodah zarah. But most of the Jews, most of the Chachamim, did not think that. Most of the Chachamim agreed with Avram ibn Ezra that it's a science. And even a philosopher like Rambam, who was very much a Talmid of the Rambam, he believed in astrology. So the very few Philosophim Rambamiyim agreed with the Rambam with regard to astrology. One of them who did agree with the Rambam was the Ephodi. Ephodi agrees with the Rambam that astrology is avodah zarah. And this same Ephodi, right after the massacres of 1391, is appointed chief astrologer for the king and queen of Aragon. And the other interesting thing that Maud Hasdai, in her book she has a book on Ephodi, and she says it's very interesting that in the Crown of Aragon they have a lot of documents. We have a lot of documents about Rav Hasdai Crescas, for example. He shows up in the court here, he shows up there, he does this, he does that. They documented everything. So there are really all kinds of documents about Rav Hasdai Crescas, and not only him, but the Ran. We have documents about the Ran. We have documents about all these all the Jews who were. There's nothing about Ephodi. There's just one document that he gets appointed head astrologer. Outside of that, there's nothing. And so I think what Rav Hasdai Crescas did in this case, he arranged for him to get this fictitious appointment as head astrologer. And once you're head astrologer, you're an officer of the king. And once you're an officer of the king, no one can touch you.
You have a diplomatic passport.
You have a diplomatic passport. It's a diplomatic passport, exactly.
He probably saw in the stars that he has to be quiet for the rest of his life.
Right? But he wasn't quiet the rest of his life. That's the usually.
He caused a lot of trouble until today.
He caused Ephodi wrote until today the most severe books against Christianity.
Alti
Kapotecha, right, okay.
He wrote them both.
Yeah, and Klimat Goyim, he wrote them both. So I think that in those two cases, Rav Hasdai Crescas, you can see him working for his friends. That he was able to arrange a ship to take the Rivash to Algeria, and he was able to arrange a position in the court for the Ephodi. And Ephodi, not only did he write those two books against Christianity, but he also wrote that tremendous, very, very, very important work, Massacre, and he also wrote commentary. He also wrote a commentary on Moreh Nevuchim, which is printed in all the. Ephodi has a commentary in all the traditional editions of Moreh Nevuchim. You have a perush of the Ephodi. So he was writing all these important Jewish works in Hebrew, and while he was and he was able to do it because he was an officer of the king.
And he never denounced his conversion, probably.
No, he never denounced.
Officially, he was a Christian.
He was paying taxes. He was paying taxes as a Christian until he died.
Wow.
That was, yeah.
Wow.
He stayed in the corpus of Jewish learning just why? Because he was considered religious still?
He, as far as we know, he kept on going to shul every day, and he was a purposely right. I think in many cases of conversions, the conversions were not really didn't have a behavioral effect. I think many people who converted
Democrats on the ballot, that's it.
You're registered.
Reno.
There is Arabs. that
Reno.
say The Rambam also converted.
Right.
Republican in name only.
Right. There's also
Yeah.
there's also evidence that the Rambam converted to Islam as a forced conversion when he
But
was
we don't know. We don't. It's Arabs. This is what they say.
right. But the Arab who says it. The Arab who says it was a very serious historian who was a friend of Abraham ben Harambam, and also I think so, and who knew the Rambam personally, and
Maybe he only converted to Sufism, which isn't so bad.
no, but the Rambam says explicitly
No,
if
I
you
think
convert to
convert to-
Rambam says explicitly if you convert to Islam, you're only over on telling a lie. You're not over on avodah
The
zarah.
Radvasals.
You're over and telling a lie, and you're telling a lie to save your life, which is you're allowed to do. But the reason is that people think that the Rambam, besides this statement in his historical book by a serious historian who knew the Rambam personally and also knew.
And the Rambam Segeres that he's like very bad. These people,
Geras
even
Hashmad.
though
The-
Nageres Hashmad.
Right, in the Geras Hashmad.
You can see he's
So-
very apologetic about these people that don't
Convert
go to
to
Islam.
Right. So you
How can
have
it convert?
the
During World War
Abraham.
I, Turkey officially said to their soldiers, while we divided with Germany, this Kaiser William in a secret ceremony converted to Islam, and that's why we defied
This comes to
among the
conversion.
Germans.
Right, okay.
In the moment.
So you have, but you have the thing with the Rambam.
Great.
Rambam had to leave Cordova
It's not illegal.
because the Moahidun, the Almohades took over,
She can.
and they outlawed
So
Judaism.
we do know the Rambam.
And then he moved to Morocco.
Where they
But
were.
Morocco, they were also outlawed in Morocco. So the question is, how is Rambam, when he gets to Egypt, he's already, they're looser and they don't persecute Jews, so he can come back to us. But how is he surviving in Morocco? So that's why the historians, in addition to this particular statement of the historian, who's a reliable historian who knew the Rambam, you have the question of how the Rambam's family were surviving in Morocco.
But if he was
But here
open to it, he could have
again,
stayed in
the
Cordova.
presupposition is they were continuing to live as Jews. They were just officially considered non-Jews because you weren't allowed to be Jewish, but they were still observing the mitzvot.
He could have stayed in Cordova if he was willing to do this.
Right. But that's apparently for some reason it was easier to survive in Morocco than in Cordova. Okay, but I think in many cases we simply don't know what it meant to convert in those days.
We don't know.
That it may just in many cases it may just have been a okay. Let's move on with.
Understand the different lifestyle.
Okay. Okay. משם פסע הנגע בקהילת מיורקה העדינה לחוף ימים תשכון ביום ראש חודש אלול באו בה פריצים ויחללוה בזזוה שללוה עשוה כמצולה שאין בה דגים. This also is in the Gemara. There's also we were talking about ibur and ahur. So there's a machloket in the Gemara whether it's kemitzula she'ein badagim or kemitzuda she'ein badagan. Right, and there are two different metaphors that sound the same, but they're completely different. But kemitzula she'ein badagim. מתו בקדושה כמו 300 נפשות, כמו 800 נמלטו במגדל Migdal Hamelech v'Hanisharim Hemiru. So this is something he's saying again and again, that the kings allowed the Jews to escape into the towers, into the Migdalim, into the towers, but it didn't always help. And now we come to Barcelona.
Mallorca is in the island of Palma.
Yes, the Palma is a city in Mallorca, I think.
So
Palma is a city, right, in Mallorca.
it's an island, right?
It's an island, right?
So they made a
Beautiful
detour,
beaches.
I guess.
Well, maybe not the same, but maybe different ones, but it's not
Does
far
it say
away.
Mallorca? Is
Mallorca,
it
yes.
It's a tourist
Greek
destination.
island? Mallorca?
Mallorca is off, it's not far from Barcelona, right?
It's not Greek,
But
it's
it's
Spanish.
if
Spain, yeah.
this is the Mallorca.
That's Mallorca, exactly.
So then they
Still
came
have the beaches,
from
love?
was it Valencia? They made a
Right.
detour and then they went.
Well, maybe
down
they
to-
came to Valencia. They all came in ships. They were coming in ships. They came from Castile in boats. So some of the boats went east and some went west, and they went to Mallorca. The Tashbates comes from Mallorca. Mallorca was also considered. It was an island, but it was at that time was considered part of Aragon, just like part of the crown of Aragon, just like all of like Barcelona and okay.
Yom Shabbos.
V'yom Shabbat acharav shafach. Now we're getting to Barcelona. Shafach Hashem ka'esh chamato. Right, he's using again all this very strong language from Megillat Eicha. Shafach Hashem ka'esh chamato. Nier mikdasho v'chilel nezer torato v'huvka'a kehilat Barcelona. This is Hasdai Crescas comes from a family that many generations was Rabbanim in Barcelona, and he. So this is Biyom hahu ba mispar harugim kamo 250 nefashot v'chol yeter hakahal nasu el hamigdal. V'sham nimlatu. So they all escaped into the tower. They're the ones who weren't killed. V'ha'oivim bazazu kol mesilat ha'yehudim v'hetzitu esh biktzata. Right. This is just
like Hamas.
Just like Hamas. Exactly. There's no right. They what is it? This is what happens in a massacre. That they come in, they kill, they attack, they rape, they murder, and. It's not.
It doesn't say here about rape.
No, it doesn't say, but it was probably the case. I think there can. Right. Vehetzitu esh biktzata, v'yad manhigei hamedina lo hayta b'ma'al, ach hitavu lahatzilam b'chol yecholtam. So someone wrote, one of the historians say that Crescas was an apologist for the government, but I don't read this as being an apologist. I mean, he was certainly a friend of the king and the queen. He was definitely very close to the king and the queen. But I think this is true. I think the king and the queen really did try to protect the Jews, but they weren't able to. And so you could say, how is it possible that the king and the queen sitting in Saragossa, and we have the letters that they wrote to their vassals in Barcelona and in other places, protect the Jews, but they didn't have the power. So you say, how is it possible that the king and the queen, the big king and queen of Aragon sitting in Saragossa, they weren't able to protect the Jews in Barcelona? But then you could say, how is it possible that the Israeli government in Yerushalayim wasn't able to protect the Jews on the Otef Aza, right? And when there's a massacre, it's very hard to stop it. It's once a massacre comes and you have hundreds and thousands of people breaking in and murdering, it's very difficult for any government to control it. So I think,
Even though we're talking about weeks already that's going on the massacre.
right.
Months.
That's true.
Months.
Right. The Israeli case
No,
was
wait.
only for 2 days, but here,
How about the
We're
Indian?
talking
right.
months.
Here we're talking about
from
2 to 3 months, right?
Tammuz of Elul.
Right.
It was insurrection. You have it in countries.
Yeah, right. But in each place, it was only 2 or 3 days.
Right.
In other words, they went from place to place. Just like they went from kibbutz to place to kibbutz. Here they go from place to place. First they go to they go to Seville, then they go to Cordova, then they go to Toledo.
They move very fast. If you follow the map, the amount
Yeah.
of miles that they cover, they don't stop.
Right,
They just
right.
keep going.
Right.
Time of months.
It was
Huh?
probably local.
But
It
he
wasn't
says that they covered 70
pounds or villages.
pounds in just in like
3
it's
months.
a lot of miles. It's
Yeah,
it's not 3 months.
I'm sure the Jews fought back, and a lot of them were. It was like a real religious
Right,
war.
right. It was a war. Well, you can see the language that he uses over here. ביום ההוא בא מספר ההרוגים כמו 250 נפשות, וכל יתר הקהל נסו אל המגדל ושם נמלטו, והאויבים בזזו כל מסילת היהודים והציתו אש בקצתה, ויד מנהיגי המדינה לא הייתה במעל, אך התאבו להצילם בכל יכולתם, וכלכלם שם בלחם ובמים, ויתעזרו לעשות שפטים ואנשים הפולשים. So there was an attempt on the part of the king to punish those who were attacking the Jews. אז קם שעון דלת העם, right, the peasants, והמון רבה, al nichbedei hamedina, right? The vassals were unable to control the peasants. V'yilachmu ima Yehudim asher b'migdal. So there was, like Yoel said, it's a fight. They were fighting with the Jews in the Migdal. V'yilachmu ima Yehudim asher b'migdal, im kshatot u'blistarot, with all kinds of these medieval weapons, right? Bows and catapults. Vayakum, vayachtum, shama b'migdal. Rabim kidshu et Hashem. So he says Rabim kidshu. So with regard to Barcelona, he says Rabim kidshu et Hashem b'tocham b'ni yechidi chatan ben shana set tamim ha'elitiv la'olam. Atzdik alai hadin be'et nachem letov chelko u'l'imut goralo. So this is a statement about his son.
He was a baby, 1 year old.
No. So here I have a lot of notes about this.
That's how it translates.
I have a lot of notes about this thing. And if you look in the bottom, I bring a lot of sources in 33 to explain what it means. Rabim kishu et Hashem u'betocham b'ni yechidi chatan ben shana. So there's this idea, chatan and a melech. It's based on the pasuk of Shlomo HaMelech, Melach Shlomo ben Shana. The idea is every chatan and every melech and every chatan is as if he is ben shana, as it says.
It was neshama of his marriage. That's what it means.
Why can't it mean
Yes,
he was a baby?
that's probably what it
Why
means.
can't it mean he was a year-old baby?
Because we see
Kiddush Hashem.
Kiddush Hashem, and also there are other documents that he says when he writes. We have other documents where the king is saying to ask, telling his vassals to particularly save Hasdai, Crescas, his son, and his family, and his colleague, and his entourage, and his colleagues.
So before that, so he must
But
have
also, there's this over. If you look in note
33.
33. B'tocham b'ni yechidi chatan ben shana.
Is it son-in-law or son?
V'haleu sham le'olam.
been...
Okay, Shmot. First of all, you have in Shmot Yud Bet. There's a lot of references going on here. Shmot Yud Bet Chet. Of course, we're going to Korban Pesach. Set Tamim Zachar Ben Shana. So you have the se of that Ayeh Hasel Ola, and then you have the se in Korban Pesach is Ben Shana. The Zohar puts these two together, and the Zohar says Vayar vehine ayel echad uben shnato haya, right? Vira. Okay. So according to the Zohar, there's a connection between the se ben shana and the Akedah.
So he's referencing his son.
Right, and he's referencing
as
the
if.
as a set and as an Akedah, right?
And if you look
V'ra'u, but then you have in Midrash Shmuel, you have Ben Shana Shaul b'Molcho, and Chacham v'Chatan v'Nasi Hagedula Mechaperet. So they get a new slate when they take over.
So you start counting again.
You start counting again. When you get married, you start counting. In your Chatan, you start counting again as you begin a new life.
How can it just mean he's married for a year?
When
Because it doesn't mean that.
Chatan ben Shana.
it could, but there are all these references. Not only that, but you might find in the history books that Gretz writes it and others writing that he was Chatan ben Esrim. Why? Because in one of the transcripts of the manuscript, the ben is written like a kaf.
Oh.
So it looks so it looks like he's Esrim, he's 20, Chatan Esrim. But that's what the Esrim comes from, which is a complete mistake.
The Gemara says that once the baby is went through Milah,
Right.
he's like a Chatan.
Like a Chatan.
Right.
Right, a
Yeah,
Chatan. Okay.
Chatan means a cutie.
Right.
That's what it
So you
means.
have this here in this midrash
So you're a
over here.
Chatan.
And right, so a lot of other, so this appears in a lot of other midrashim too. But the idea is both a chatan and a melech, a chatan and a melech begin a new slate after they. So it means that it was his first year of marriage, chatan ben shana, and that seems to be that's what he says about Helitiv la Ola. Of course, Hasdai Crescas was physically in Saragossa all this time. We know he was physically in Saragossa all this time because of all the documents we have in the court. I mentioned the court; everything is documented in the court. So we have him documented virtually every day that he's doing something and he's acting to try to save the Jews. Atzdik alai hadin ve'etnachem l'tuv chelko u'lemimot gorolo umehem rabim sheshachtu et atzmam. Okay, so here umehem hipilu et atzmam mehamigdal v'lo higiu lechatzi hamigdal ad shenasu avarim. So there are those who kill themselves by jumping off the top of the tower.
What does this mean? I mean, is it possible? What tower and how tall was that tower that they were actually?
No, because
60
we're
feet.
shooting arrows at it. We're shooting
No,
arrows.
they jumped off the roof. It was 60 feet.
But in middle and after 30.
Ad shenasa ivrim is a play on the Sui Lazuzel. It doesn't mean that they fell
So
on
it was a
hill.
rain of
It's a hill.
arrows. It was
Could be.
raining
Right,
arrows
right.
and things against the thing.
Some of them are on slopes.
Yeah, they were on slope, European slopes.
Yeah. A lot of these castles have slopes.
Yeah. וקצתם יצאו ברחוב ושם קידשו את השם וכל השאר המירו. And many, so you have here, I think they said 150,000 Jews converted to Christianity. Many thousands were murdered. רק היו מעטים שנמלטו בערי הסקנים, נהר יכתבן. Only a few were able to escape. Ach hema me'anichbedim, right? The noble Jews, the rich Jews were able to escape.
That's at 150,000?
100, I think that's what I wrote in my book when I checked it. 150,000 Jews converted.
You see? Oh, who converted?
Yeah.
And how many number were killed in total?
There's a dispute about how many were killed, but probably when you add up whatever Hasdai Crescas says, he's probably right.
For sure that all these conversions were just like you checked the ballot box and you said I'm Republican and that was next. You continued living like a Jew.
I think many of them were like that.
The
I mean, you
150,000.
don't-
That's the big tragedy that they had the ballot box.
No, many of them weren't like them. Your communities were destroyed. You couldn't, you weren't allowed to.
That's not what you said. I mean, you said you suggested that you can continue living like a Jew. You go back to Shul and Barber.
No, that's if you were that was the case with Echodi.
If you're the astrologer, if you're the astrologer.
If you were an officer of the king, you could do that. I don't.
Inquisition was
But I don't think we have. I mean, we know that there were that in Spain even up until the present day, there are people who are observing Jewish, Jewish traditions.
After the expulsion, like from the time the Inquisition was around, they couldn't do anything anymore. They couldn't be secret Jews anymore.
Right, but they.
Well, this is 100 years before the expulsion.
That's right.
Yeah, it's 100 years before the expulsion. But after the expulsion, we knew that there were Jews who would keep gefilte fish back in their refrigerators, and that they would do it. And up until today, you have Christians.
The jar said borscht, and really it was gefilte fish.
Right.
Are there any records of serious conversions? Of like
Yes, of
people
course there were serious. Look, we have
from
some
this story?
Yes, you have. See, that's what I said.
Which year was Shlomo Levi? Not these years.
Shlomo Levi, I think Efodi wrote Al Tehi Kavatecha against him, right?
It was that years.
It was right then, right?
Big Rav, got converted.
Right. So Shlomo Levi, Efodi says to him, I don't know, you really believe this stuff? You really believe this and this and this and this? And
Maybe as a Jew he also didn't believe what Efodi believed.
Oh, who knows? I don't know. But Efodi says, what?
Most Jews today don't believe what Efodi believes.
The Sache ist, es ist nicht wenig gerecht, wie die meinen, die ganze Sache.
Most Jews today don't believe what Efodi believes. Judaism.
Ich kann gelächter, das ist gewesen.
Nein,
der Ruf ist geworden der Ruf ist geworden erste Christ, ist gewesen erste Chusset, Vater.
What we know is these kehilot were completely destroyed. Many right, a lot of them completely.
It's right, Barcelona. That's what he writes about Barcelona.
Barcelona, completely destroyed. Barcelona was one of the biggest.
Since then, Barcelona stayed Judenreich.
Right, until about 100 years ago, they started. Right now.
Kifni and Bais, he converted.
Kifni and Bais.
Shlomo Levi converted Kifni and Bais. Because
That's a year later.
Because the plot, because of the plot.
Not even forced.
Right, but then he became you have many converts who become very active anti-Jews. But
there's a book about him, I think.
Pablo de Santa Maria.
He became a bishop. Right, became a bishop. So also many times you converted and you got a good job. So you always have. I mean, there are all different kinds of converts. You can.
But the youngest son, Todris, his youngest son.
Yeah, who was his youngest son?
Todris.
Oh, Todris was his youngest son. Very interesting. And okay,
the name is Chris.
So, right, so you can never tell what's going to happen. Okay, so let's continue anyway.
I have a friend that his name is Shimon Deitch. You know Shimon Deitch?
I know.
His wife, Chiyuta, she's a writer.
Right. I know. She wrote a book on Nechama Leibovitz.
Yeah, but she also wrote a book on the wife of Shlomo Levi that she didn't want to convert.
Yeah.
The wife of Shlomo Levi, they stayed married, but she didn't convert. Only Shlomo Levi.
That's very interesting.
She wrote a whole book on her.
They stayed married.
He became a bishop.
Fine.
I can't tell you. Just telling you the story.
Yeah, okay, so there are all kinds of interesting cases. But,
if I remember correctly, it's not clear that they stayed married. I think because
maybe not.
ומהם, וקצתם יצאו ברחוב, ברוב עווננו אין היום בברצלונה איש בשם ישראל יכנה. וכן בעיר לידה מתו רבים והשאר המירו, רק היו מעטים שנמלטו. בעיר ג'ירונה, תורה וענווה במקום אחד, קידשו השם ברבים הרבנים אשר שם, לא המירו בה כי אם מעטים, ורוב הקהל נמלטו בבתי העירונים, הבורגנים העירונים, והם היום במגדל. So in Gerona, it says Kidshu Rabbanim Kidshu et Hashem, and many of the people were able to escape.
Was Gerona the capital still of Catalan at that time? Or was it capital? Of
I don't know.
Catalan?
I don't think Girona was the capital, but it was the main city. I think Barcelona and Saragossa, which maybe Girona, maybe. One thing in Girona, they have now a center, a Rambam center, a center in honor of a center for a Jewish museum in honor of the Rambam, who was originally from Gerona, later on in Barcelona.
They say they still have his house. His house is still
His
standing.
house, really?
That's what people say. Yeah.
Maybe. Well, you have to be careful about what people say.
No, that's some historians say.
It may be, because it's hard for a house to really survive those.
You do have in England. You have houses 1,000 years old.
No.
Well, you have Stonehenge, but I don't know
No,
if you.
that's not.
I know houses.
I'm talking about
Right. You really have houses?
Aaron of Lincoln's house.
There are no houses. The oldest house in England is
Aaron of
600 years
Lincoln's
old.
house is still standing. That's what they
Whose
say.
house?
Aaron
There's a
of
door.
Lincoln.
Yeah, really?
Yeah.
I don't
No,
know.
that's
Well,
just 700 years old. That house.
That's 700.
There are churches 1,000 years old. There are churches 1,000 years old.
No, the oldest house.
So
is
I know
the Jewish
in-
house, the Jewish.
In Troyes, the city of Rashi,
Right.
they know the area where Rashi's house was, but it's not the same building.
Right.
So same thing. I think they
'cause
generally.
Generally, houses don't last that long.
So, right, but there are sometimes you see some remains of it, but usually you don't see the houses itself. So now he sums things up. Sof davar b'malchut Valencia, lo nishar Yehudi zulatei b'makom echad hanikra Morvedio, b'machos Catalunya, lo nishar Yehudi zulatei ba'arei haskanim v'hapachot, ובמקומותם לא שלחו יד בהם. אנחנו פה היום בכל מדינת ארגון, it's basically Saragossa, the area of Saragossa. אין פרץ ואין יוצאת, וחמלת השם עלינו הותיר שריד בכל מקומות אלו. אחר ההשתדלות הנמרץ ופיזור הרב בכל רכושנו. Crescas was a very wealthy man. He gave all his wealth to try to reconstruct and to bribe people and to reconstruct the Jewish communities. Lo nishar lanu bilti im gviyatenu. That's what's left. Lo nishar lanu bilti im gviyatenu. Uvechol zot libenu yehege ema. ועינינו אל אבינו שבשמיים נשואות, עד שיחוננו וירפאנו ממכאובינו. ואל ייתן למות רגלינו, ישוב ירחמנו, אמן כן יעשה. Then he concludes, וישפוט שלום לנו ולכם. This word ישפוט, Rashi explains it from right, lahachin, or to as he will give peace. He will prepare peace to you and us. It's a pasuk that appears in Yeshayahu, as I bring here. And Rashi explains it according to the story of Elisha. Shvot hasir hagadolah. Prepare the big pot. So it was the expression that they used. Vayishpot shalom lanu. Yishlach ezreinu mikodesh. Kenafshechem ukenefesh achichem, Hasdai Crescas. Ad kan tofes it. So how would we describe his own theologically? How do we, in terms of his emunah, how do we describe his?
No complaints whatsoever.
I find
he didn't ask where was God in Auschwitz. He didn't have those issues.
What is it?
I also
says
find it
that no Moshe
striking
Shem
that
Kuchen,
his
silent
son
with
is
the
sandwiched
Katie.
somewhere in the middle.
Right.
It's not like he's
You have
ending
to.
up
And
and
he's also not saying that we did something wrong to deserve it.
Right. He doesn't give an
He didn't say it
explanation that
was
we did something
Zionism,
He
wrong.
didn't say it's because of philosophy.
smart.
No, he doesn't say it's because of anything. He doesn't say.
But how
But
can
it
you
says
not-
himself
This
in
is
the
a very
Katie,
good.
It's
This is a very good point that he doesn't say it's because of philosophy. He doesn't say it's because of
I
anything.
said it as a joke, but it's a very Jewish thing to say that why did Hashem Kuchu? If not, that
He
Shefa
did.
gets upset. We have to ask. We have to rash. We have to reason.
Right. But
He's
here,
not, he's not
Well, I
even
wanna-
judging the people who converted.
he's not. He's just giving the facts.
But,
He's
but
giving-
you can't know anything on this letter because we
He's
don't
giving
know
the
what,
facts.
what was the function of this letter. Maybe the
Yeah.
function
If
was
to give facts,
just to give the facts.
just to give the facts.
Maybe
but we
maybe
see,
there was things that he wrote then and
maybe, but that's absolutely. But we do see that he's complete identification with Yirmiyahu Necha. That's a complete identification with.
but Hashem it. I'm saying
No, but even Yirmiyahu, he doesn't take any proofs. Yirmiyahu has every part is different. One is that Yirmiyahu complains against Hashem, and one is complaining against the Jews. He's just using the ones complaining against
Right,
Hashem. He doesn't
right,
complain.
right.
But this is a live
Although
letter.
he's not. I wouldn't
He's
say.
writing this while the Jews are still being
He's not
killed.
really complaining. He's saying right.
No time to
It's true. He's
editorialize
saying
for them.
darach kashto, but he's saying it, as a fact. He's not.
Right.
He's
was
not.
there,
just like
was
saying
there,
that
was there
there's
a
no
bunch
reason
that
to
blamed it on
editorialize at
philosophy
this
in that
point.
time? I'm not talking about the Girish Svar. But in that time, was there a bunch that blamed it on philosophy?
No, there's two.
I'm not talking after the 100 years later.
like the children of the
I'm not
Rosh.
talking like the Yosef Yavitz and these people. This is
Russians,
already 100
the
years
Russians.
later by the Girish Svar. I'm talking by this
The Russians
kufa.
didn't claim
Was
it.
there people that blamed it on philosophy?
Well, of course, you had tremendous critiques of philosophy in the Vikuach al Rambam and the Rambam. No. In terms
Keep knowledge. That is keeping knowledge.
no, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Say that God killed people
Yosef Yavitz blamed the Girish Svar.
observation.
What are you
What
saying? That what?
He's not saying that it's an order.
No. Yosef Yavitz is saying why people converted, like on the Anafsha. But I'm saying,
It's an historical observation.
Oh,
I'm asking if this observation was also done keeping
one thing.
or not.
One thing I should mention, we've already finished the time, but I didn't say anything about I discussed it with Asher before, about the so-called Igeret of Reuven ben Aran. I should
Say a few words. Yeah.
say one or two words of it. If you look in what I wrote in that book on Hasdai Crescas, you see that in addition to this statement of Hasdai Crescas, there's also what I thought was authentic at the time, a kina of Reuven ben Haran. And this kina of Reuven ben Haran, supposedly written by Reuven ben Haran, appears on the back of a gvil of a Sefer Torah, which was supposedly written by Haran.
It's a Hebrew university.
Oh, right in there. If you walk into the Hebrew University Library, you see it right there, the Sefer Torah of the Haran. However, already it was supposedly discovered in around 1930 by Rabbi Toledano in Tveria, who said that.
But now we know what a big tzaddik he was.
Yeah, and he was a big tzaddik. He was, and and there were always those who doubted the authenticity of this Sefer Torah.
There's two rounds.
They gave out a book not long ago, like a half a year ago.
1,000 pages.
They gave it a whole book, 1,000 pages, to Megala, all his Shkarim Miksavim.
Oh, yeah, really?
There was
Prof. Toledano.
Yeah, there's
Moshe Hillel.
He did do a lot.
Yaakov Hillel's son.
Right.
Avat Shalom. They gave it, his son gave it out.
Okay, so
So
this was also his doing. This was also his doing that he as it were, discovered the Sefer Torah of the Quran. But already, in I think the late 40s, early 50s, Rav Kalman Kahana, who was not only an important, he was the head of Poalei Aguda.
Talmud Chaznish.
Yeah, and also he agreed with the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish also said it's a forgery. The Chazon Ish said it's a forgery. And Kalman Kahana, who was a Talmid Mufak in the Chazon Ish, he was a politician, but he was also a Talmid Chacham. He showed that the Sefer Torah was written against the halacha of the Ran. That the kuf, for example, when you're at a kuf, there's a question whether the Vav part of the kuf should be touching the roof or not. And whatever it was, it's the other way around. The Quran says it's not supposed to touch, and in the Sefer Torah they touch it. So he showed a number of examples where the Sefer Torah is written against the halacha of the Quran. So he said the Quran could not have written it. And this, of course, expresses the view of the organizers.
What shaykhs does the letter have with the Sefer Torah?
Oh, because
the Sefer
the Sefer Torah was the Sefer Torah was presumably written by the Ran. So if the Ran writes the Sefer Torah, you would figure he's going to write according to his halacha. That he was what he called.
So do they now believe that it was a complete forgery?
Complete forgery.
Where was the letter?
Did they take an old Sefer Torah and attribute it to the Ran, or did they make it completely?
They took a Sefer Torah written 300 years after the death of the Ran.
There was money involved in this, or
what?
The dealers did it?
Not money.
Yeah.
First of all, it was money, but first of all, it's also fame. It's fame.
To make such a discovery.
They have the letters of the Rambam. They needed the Ran Sefer Torah thing.
Well, look, the forgers do all kinds of things. There are all kinds of
For
things.
money, but not for prestige.
There are all kinds.
No,
that
they build another
getroffen
forgery.
Sachen.
They establish the son of the Ran, and then you
Ich
find
habe, by
it
the way,
filled.
empty books.
So, anyway,
Antique book.
I had a few years ago, before they proved that it was, so they sent it for carbon dating, and they found out that it was that the Sefer Torah was 300 years after the Ran. But before they proved it, I had a seminar on the Drashot Haran, and one student came up to me and said, "Look, I don't really know so much about philosophy, but I'd like to write some paper about the Drashot Haran. What can I do? I'm a specialist in, he studied language, Lashon." So I said, well, why don't you take the Kina of Reuven ben Aran, and according to the Lashon, try to figure out when it was written. So he looked at it and he found that there are all kinds of expressions. One expression there is Sho'afei Damim. Sho'afei Damim. That the Christian priests were Sho'afei Damim. That this expression, Sho'afei Damim, was anybody know this expression? It was very popular in Hebrew in the late 19th, early 20th century because it translates a Polish and Russian term. The last one who actually used
it to what?
From
a word from Polish.
Which
I don't know what it is.
That's like I said, bloodsuckers, no?
But it's not like in English you say blood. There's bloodsucker. There's bloodthirsty. There's blood, but this is sho'ef, and apparently the sho'ef is exactly like what they say in Polish and Russian, isn't it?
And
in any case, the last one who used that expression, Begin, used to use it all the time, but it was used a lot by writers whose native language was Polish or Russian. They would use this expression. So he showed that this had to be written in the 20th century by someone who.
Toledano was Polish.
No, Toledano wasn't. But the piyut. The piyut was written. The piyut had to be done by two different people. Why? Because if you look at what I wrote in my little book on Hasdai Crescas there, I say that physically it could not have been written by Reuven ben Aran himself because there are spelling mistakes, including that he spelled the name of his city, Girona, wrong. That's impossible for someone who lived in. So he makes some errors in. So it could have been authentic, but the person who wrote it on the Gvil was copied it off from someone else. So that's possible. That's what I thought when I wrote the book. But I realized it couldn't have been the Reuven ben Aran himself who wrote it. But you had two people who were working together. One was the one who wrote it, which was someone who knew, of course, Hasdai Crescas and also maybe studied with Yitzhak Ber and knew some historical documents that he brought in. And the other was someone who was a sofer, who knew how to write in the style.
Somebody that writes on the Sefer Torah already, that's not allowed, right? Like to go and write.
Well, on the back of the Sefer Torah, you're on the back of the Gvil at the beginning. Apparently, what's the halacha? You can probably.
I think it was common.
Yeah, they used to write on the back of the Gvil, not on the Sefer Torah itself. The back of the Gvil, but in any case. you needed two people to do it. One person who knew how to write the kina had to be someone who had some kind of poetic ability and also knew historically what happened, had studied the history. But that person didn't necessarily know was not necessarily a sofer. So you had to be a sofer. You had to know how to write, not only write as a sofer, but to write in the style of a sofer. Writing in the days of the Ran.
We need to know if it was sold in an auction. If it was.
They sold it for a lot of money to the Hebrew.
There you go.
To the Hebrew to the National Library. The National Library bought it.
And they never gave up because they were.
They never. Well, what did they do?
What did they still
Unfortunately, I don't want to.
Was the librarian of the Hebrew National
I don't have
Library.
any.
How do they still display it?
I don't think they do. I don't think.
Professor, why don't you call on your wife to finish the
Was the
story?
librarian? Was the librarian involved?
I don't want to. I don't have anything personally against Harav Professor Shlomo Zalman Havlin, but because I mentioned him last time in what he said against that Rav Fisher shouldn't have ruined the Kabbalah in Or Hashem, shouldn't have taken the Kabbalah out of Or Hashem. But the National Library, now the National Library no longer is connected with the Hebrew University, it's independent, the National Library of Israel. But in those days, the National Library of Israel was also part of the Hebrew University. And they brought in Harav Professor Shlomo Zalman Havlin, who was an expert on the writings of Sefer Torah, and they asked him to check to see whether it's authentic. And he wrote a big essay in which he deals with the arguments of Harav Talmud Kahana, in which he argues that it's authentic, that the Ran really wrote it. And a lot of people didn't accept it. The library, of course, accepted it. And that's why they put it in the front, that as you walked into the library and you saw it right away, it was on display.
Still have it there.
Well, now there's
now
there's a new building of the library. I don't think they have, and I think after they carbon dating proved that it was
the last 15, 20 years?
Yeah, less than that, less about.
How come they waited this long to carbon date it? I mean, you could have done it 15
Because
years ago.
Well, I have to go to America.
There were a lot of articles. All of a sudden, for some reason, I don't know why. About 10 years ago, there were a lot of articles in the Haredi magazines. There were a lot of articles.
We were talking here about if Crescas has what to say on Gezeiras Kiflin Aleph, and now we're asking Professor of our times, Professor Harvey, what do you say to the Gezeiras that happened Tufshin Paidalet in Israel? What's your say on this thing?
First, my say is it's very similar. They did the same when you have a massacre. The reason that I decided to talk about this today is because it's very similar. That the Christians came in from the outside. They went from one city to another city. They massacred people in one city and next city. The Jews tried to fight, but they didn't have weapons. They weren't able to defend themselves, and they went from one city to another city, and they destroyed whole communities. So. It's very similar, but it's not supposed to happen in Eretz Yisrael. I don't have to say this in the Satmar place. This is not supposed to happen in Eretz Yisrael. That's the whole.
It's not supposed to happen theologically.
Let the professor talk, please.
Well, I'm not talking about theologically. I'm saying if you have you have a place to defend yourself. Theologically, I mean, it wasn't supposed to happen here theologically either, but then. It happens. We see that Hasdai Crescas is not at all raised. There's a lot of theology here because he's mentioning Hashem in almost every sentence.
One is a hit and run, and one is a continuous
process. What say theologically on this
event?
Now in our times.
What
will you say? Tell us what you told me.
What did I tell you about Kaspi?
About Kaspi, yeah.
Or about? I'll say two things. Okay, one about the Kuzari, and one about the Kaspi. Two things I've actually wrote about both of them in one place. First about the Kuzari. There's one place in the Kuzari where the Chaver says to the Melech, he says, well, you know, the Muslims and the Christians, they're at war all the time. The Muslims are killing the Christians are killing the Muslims. They talk about being nice and morals, but all they know is war. We Jews, we're not murdering anybody. And the king there says to him something like, wait until you have a state. Now, you're not murdering anybody because you don't have the power. You don't have an army. You don't have the power to hurt. So this statement of the Kuzari was cited by Professor Ernst Simon, who was a famous professor at the Hebrew University, professor of education. From Germany. He was a friend of Martin Buber's, and he wrote after the attack on Kibbutz in 1953, I think, or something like that. The attack on Kibbutz. He wrote. He cited this passage from the Kuzari, and he said it's a test of Jewish state. How you're going to use power, whether you're going to know how to when to use power, when not to use power, and this is, he said, after in Kibbutz, in Kibbutz, then the young officer Ariel Sharon led an attack, and where then many like 70 civilians were killed, and so that was so. I think. But I don't think that the king was a pacifist. I don't think the king was saying, when you have a state, you're going to be just as bad as the Christians and the Muslims killing.
A religious state, not
the
Americans don't kill either.
I think what he said was, if you have a state, then you also have to know how to protect the people inside the state, and therefore it's just as immoral. It's immoral to use power too much, but it's also immoral not to be able to protect your people. They're both immoral. So I think that's what the Kuzari meant. The Kuzari meant that the Christians and the Muslims are killing because they have to.
What do you think now? They're using too much power?
I think now they're not using power intelligently. Let's put it that way.
Jews?
That's what I think. I think that's also the question. When you have power, there are three things. First, you shouldn't use it too much. Second, you shouldn't use it too little. Third, you should use it intelligently. Those are the three things. I think that's what the king of the Kuzari. The king of the Kuzari, after all, was a military commander. He wasn't a peacenik. He was a military commander. He led his people into war. The only thing we know about the Kuzari people is that they're known as great warriors. So the king was obviously a great warrior, and I think he didn't mean when you have power, you'll be just as bad. You'll be just as bad as the Christians and the Muslims. And so when you have power, you will necessarily have to use power, just like the Christians.
Use but not abuse.
Use but not abuse. Now, the other thing is about Caspi. There's this thing by Caspi which was very often quoted by the early religious Zionists. If you have for example, Rav Menachem Kasher used to quote it in the Torah Shlema, and according to Rav Yosef Caspi, who also wrote two commentaries on Moreh Nevuchim, he also wrote a number of very important philosophy books. He was a Maimonidean philosopher. In one of his books called Tam HaKesef, he discusses Bayit Shlishi, and he says, what about Bayit Shlishi? He says, I can bring many psukim to prove that Bayit Shlishi is going to be built. But he says, you don't need psukim. He says, it's completely natural. TV, Efshori Karov. Why? He says, because we look at history, and we see that history is Shigaon Muflag. Shigaon Muflag. This, he says, look what's going on in the world. He says, we just saw that the Muslims defeated the Christians in Akko, in Syria, and in the Galil. And at the same time, we see that the Christians defeated the Muslims in Aragon, in Mallorca, and in northern Spain. You can't see any direction in history. On the one hand, the Christians are sometimes beating the Muslims are sometimes beating the Christians. If you look out in the east, the Chinese are sometimes beating the Tatars just defeated these guys. You can't find any understanding in it. And this is the opposite of a view that you find a lot among religious Zionists in Israel, which is a view of Hegel and Borochov and Rav Avraham Yitzhak Cohen Cook, that history is very rational. You can always see precisely.
You can predict the
You can predict everything.
Direction.
If you know if you study history carefully, you can predict what's going to happen. And Caspi says no.
He said by accident the Jews will come back to Israel and build a temple.
Just-
it's not TV. It should happen.
He says
It's not TV.
he says just
Over the
as
10,000 years it's going to happen.
he says just as we these nations conquered these nations, and there's no reason can be given to it, but things change all the time. It changes all the time in history. So there's no reason why we should not come back to Eretz Israel.
Even though we wanted power, we didn't have anything. He still felt.
Yes, right.
And he's
But,
right, it's
but
happening.
another Maimonidean, Yitzhak Polkar, writing at the same time as Caspi, and they're all Maimonideans, because Yitzhak Polkar says, why is it that the Galut is lasting? Why aren't we going back to Eretz Israel? He says it's true that things always change, but HaTorah mateshet et kochenu. And because we are Rachmanim, we are sitting in yeshiva all day, and therefore we don't have the power to conquer our target.
Does Rambam himself reference anything? The fact that he wrote Hilchat Mashiach is probably because he felt that it can happen.
What Rambam says in one place in his what Rambam says in his Igeret against astrology, he writes about quotes Yirmiyahu about the destruction. He says the destruction of Bayat Rishon was because we studied astrology instead of Omanut HaMilchama. Right. So that's what the Rambam. But
how
also,
does Caspi? There was a big Maimonidean. How does he go with this? How does he
Didn't
do
know
the
about
Rambam
that
himself that writes that, like he said, the Yasha Derech HaMashiach. The Rambam does give an understanding in history.
it's because of education. The Mashiach, for the Rambam, Mashiach will come because of actions that human beings by observing the Torah, you bring about the Yemot Mashiach. The Rambam wanted to.
Isn't that Mechulok mit
He's not saying there's a He's not saying there's a necessary historical process. Rav Yonasan, he's not saying there's a necessary historical.
Where does the Rambam say that the Torah brings Mashiach?
I think
He
that
says that Ben Koifer could have been Mashiach.
Oh, right, of course.
So where does he say the Torah brings
Okay,
Mashiach?
two things.
Military brings
Well,
Mashiach.
let me say two things first. Aristotle says, Aristotle, as opposed to Hegel, Aristotle says that you can learn more from a good poem or a good play or a good tragedy than you can from history. Because if you go to a good play by Aeschylus or Euripides, these are people who understand human nature, and what happens in that novel or in that play is something that you can learn about human nature. But history, you can't learn about human nature. Sometimes the good guys win, sometimes the bad guys win.
We had big shear.
First, what they say, the history of history is that they don't learn from history. You know, is what they say.
Right.
Okay, but what are you trying to point out?
Well, I'm saying that's the view of the Rambam. The view of the Rambam doesn't hold that there's a necessary movement in history, but he does hold that it's the idea of the Torah to create. The Rambam holds it's the idea of the Torah to create